never in between. So, welcome back to Pimax Sword Science Part 2. This video is actually a little while in the making, and of course it had to be if we're going to give a real accurate review of what these controllers are like, actually having used them for a while for all my gaming needs. So, we've got good, bad, and ugly. And then, of course, I'll round this up with some closing final thoughts. So, I'm going to start with the good. One nice thing is that these are a little bit cheaper than the Knuckles, but not a whole lot more. And they probably are more expensive than they should be. But still, cheaper is cheaper. Some good things about these is that really they don't have any obvious hardware fragility. So, the trackpads are not going to break like the Knuckles joysticks will. That's a pretty important thing, that you can use your hardware without fear of breaking, right? Because of course every time you use your Knuckles, it's, is this the day that my joystick drifts and I have to beg Valve for an RMA? Not a concern with these as far as we know. I found these to be actually very comfortable controllers. I actually really like these controllers from an ergonomic perspective, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the trackpads, once you get used to them, are in fact very comfortable to use. Yeah, I mean, you just rest your thumb where you want to go. It's pretty good. Like, it's not that moving the joystick around is a lot of effort, but less effort's always good, right? You got to save those energons for bursts of violent activity. Hey, so whatever, it matters. So yeah, I found the trackpads to be quite comfortable to use. I like that. The thing about the trackpads, it's really been a bit frustrating me, honestly, is not anything to do with the trackpads, but users' unwillingness to admit that there's nothing really wrong with trackpads. I mean, they say all sorts of shit that's just frankly 100% false, and they're just pulling it right out of their butts. And then just stating as if it's a fact, which I know is a thing on the internet, but it is completely shit. And that is really that trackpads are inaccurate. Where are they getting this from? Nowhere. That's where they're getting it from. They're just making it up. If anything, the opposite is true. Although in terms of the precision you need with a VR controller, it's not an issue I would think is significant. Trackpads are not less accurate than joysticks are, and if anything, the opposite is true. Just look at them. Look at the surface area in which you have to move around. The trackpad is larger. Of course, it's more accurate. There's more area for it to move around. The problem is this accuracy is of zero benefit in VR, and frankly, the trackpads on the swords probably don't have that massive super high precision of what you found on something like the Steam controller, or even the newer Steam Decks. We don't have a problem with trackpad accuracy in those circumstances, do we? So you wouldn't in VR either. Although it is worth noting, of course, this isn't really a fair thing to say in some respects, because you don't do precision movement to the same degree as you would with a Steam controller or the trackpads on the deck, right? Use it for moving yourself around in game or turning. Your precision movement is with your hands on, you aim like you would a real weapon. So it's not really an important argument in the first place, but it is something that irritated me, is that users just sort of have it against a bias against the trackpads without any real justification. In fact, I've actually found some motions to be more natural using a trackpad than I did a joystick. Particularly if I'm playing a game like Into the Radius, where I chronically look over my shoulder, but I don't want to stop and look around, right? Because what if something's behind me? So, I found it just completely natural for me to do without even thinking about it, is to look over my shoulder and just move my thumb along the edge of the trackpad without even thinking about it, without ever changing my direction. And with a joystick, it is not nearly so smooth and natural a motion. I know some people are going to argue and be like, no, it is on the joystick. No, it isn't, because you're rotating a joystick around its periphery, not just gently sliding your thumb. It's not the same motion, and it's not as smooth. The trackpads have their places. There's advantages to them and there's disadvantages to them, okay? And all I'm saying is that sometimes I prefer a joystick, sometimes I actually like the trackpad better. The grip button on the swords is very simple, but it's pretty bulletproof. It's just a button, and it's a simple button at that. It's really just an on-off grip or not grip. There's no complexity to it at all. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But it's simple enough that you don't really run into problems with it. You're either grabbing your gun or your ammo, or you're not. So there's not a lot that really goes wrong with the grip button, which is stark contrast to the knuckles, which again I'll talk about more later. It's going to be a middle-length video here. There's a lot to say. Real simple, reliable, straightforward grip controls are very welcome. I know when these first came out, people kept looking at the tracking rings, saying they're so huge, they're going to be in the way, it's going to be a problem, you're going to bump against each other. Zero. Doesn't happen. Not even really possible, actually. See, how you're holding it is, your arms aren't, like, you're not going to touch it like this. This would be the only way if you put your arms parallel. Why would you ever do that? Our physiology is not really designed to do that. What would you be doing? The answer is you just wouldn't be. So you will not bump into these. Unless, of course, you want to. And that brings me to the next point. These are the only VR controllers I've ever used where you can comfortably and accurately two-hand a pistol. Now, if you play a lot of FPS games, or games where you just, well, probably a lot of us VR users do, but handguns often kind of suck in VR because they're actually kind of hard to aim. Aiming a handgun one-handed in real life, if you've ever done it, you know that is not the most accurate way to shoot. It is not the most accurate way to shoot. If you really want to hit your target, you grip it with two hands. But with the knuckles, that is repulsively bad just because of the way you have to hold the grip sensor. And even with the Quest 2 controllers, that tracking wing is quite large and gets in the way, and they still don't have a great shape for it. Though they're not too bad. I think you can actually reasonably stabilize a pistol with the Quest 2 controllers. However, with the index knuckles, you really can't do it in any practical way. It just sucks for that. It's probably why there's no two-handed weapons in Half-Life Alyx. You know, although for the rifles and the shotgun, I can't think of why not. Every other game has done a fine, Valve. But for the pistols, they have a point. Two-handing a pistol with the knuckles sucks. With the swords, though, there's some kind of hidden magic that happens. As you'll notice, the rings are not actually just a complete circle. They're shaped in sort of a wave. And this becomes a huge advantage. And I'm not going to say that Pimax did this intentionally. Maybe this is just serendipity, but it's real and it's pretty awesome. Look how they fit together. They kind of fit together. So like this, you are unbelievably solid. You are completely solid. Just put them together. You can sort of grip the bottom part here. And make sure you can see that. And this is as stable as you're possibly going to get in VR. And close to how stable you'd have a handgun in real life with like a Weaver grip. So that's not nothing. That's definitely something if you play a lot of shooting games. Or you like using pistols in games. And frankly, as a matter of fact, I do. So I really like that. I really like that. And that's just sort of something I found out kind of just by screwing around in games, is that finally you can accurately stabilize a handgun with a two-handed grip. You can't really do it with the other controllers. A little bit with the Quest 2 controllers, but it stinks outright with the knuckles, and with these, it is an absolute pleasure. Lastly, these are pretty rugged. These are solidly built, and I think these are probably at least as durable as the Quest 2 controllers, which are pretty goddamn durable. Except even better, maybe, because they don't have a tracking ring. Although, even with that prominent Quest 2 ring, which is probably a Qualcomm ring. Actually, it is a Qualcomm ring. That's still strangely durable, the whole thing. So it's rare to see broken controllers on a Quest 2. Yeah, so this doesn't even have that. So these are definitely solid, tough controllers. I'm not totally willing to just smash them to find out where they break. So I'll put that warning in. I haven't really heavily smash tested these, and I'm hopefully never going to. Now for the bad. I did some testing with the tracking. With one base station, these are way worse than the Knuckles. I had huge amounts of drifts that made any sort of precision impossible. Couldn't be done. I found that very surprising because these have twice the number of sensors. That's pretty disappointing. I would think with that many more sensors, they would track very well even in suboptimal conditions. Not the case. However, that said, as soon as I had two base stations, I found no difference in their tracking at all. So the lesson here is probably due to the shape of the tracking ring, it really does want two sensors. And that's kind of unfortunate. It would have been nice if this had some tracking advantage that was tangible, but as far as I can tell, they really don't. The Knuckles track no better, no worse. Unless, of course, you have one base station, then the Knuckles track 10 times better. So the extra sensors really aren't doing anything, and their presence is probably only to make up for the fact that because it wraps around your wrist, some of them are always going to be occluded. And that's probably why there's more sensors, not actually to enhance accuracy or tracking or anything like that, unfortunately. Speaking of that, these do have a higher polling rate. They do have a higher refresh rate on the controllers than the Knuckles do. I gotta tell you though, I didn't notice anything. I just didn't. And how much better? Pimax hasn't actually said. They just said it's faster. So it could be slightly faster, or even if it is a lot faster, I gotta tell you, I didn't notice. So there's no real practical advantage to that being there anyway. Now some other problems that are a bit more irritating, because I'm assuming if you do any sort of standing or room scale, you're gonna have at least two base stations, so it just won't matter. The controller settings are totally inconsistent between games, and probably anybody who has Vive wands can confirm this, that games just aren't consistent. Some games will have you click to move, most games will use touch to move, but it's completely random, say turning. So turning is, in my opinion, best done by having the right controller work as a D-pad. And then you'd click left or right to turn left or right, and then you have 3 more buttons for whatever other functions you need in game, like dropping a magazine or jumping, etc. That makes perfect sense, and when configured like that, very natural and good, and just zero problems. I really like that for games that don't fuck this up. But many games do fuck it up, and you can't change it. If you could just change it, I kind of wouldn't care, because, well, you still have to tweak settings for the Knuckles, which I'll get into later. Anyway, so tweaking your settings is just kind of part of it, unfortunately. But what I really found with the swords is just sometimes you fucking can't. The settings you need aren't there. They're just not there. A number of games will have snap turning on click to rotate, but as soon as you set it to smooth, they switch off to touch, which is awkward because now you may have other buttons configured on that D-pad that will now cause your character to do 2 things, right? So you'll move, if you have down to drop the magazine out of your gun, now your character's also going to take a step back whenever you do that, etc., etc. You can see the problem right away. There's a reason why I like having touch to move on my left, because it's easy and natural and takes no effort to do so. You just lazily put your thumb where you want to go and you go there. It's actually very awesome. But for turning, I do want to keep that as a D-pad so I can take advantage of the fact that I can potentially have a bunch of buttons there. But developers fucked this up. I can't actually configure it like that because SteamVR has things contextually, and if the developers didn't put the right options in the right contexts, and they rarely fucking do, there's just nothing you can do. You just cannot configure your controller the way you want. It's very frustrating, and there's just no goddamn reason for it, except that developers are often very lazy when it comes to getting the fine-tuned details right of their games. And you really notice this a lot more with the swords than when you do with, say, the Knuckles, or frankly with the Quest 2. The controls are always just perfect out of the box anyway with the Quest 2. Right, it's the most common headset, so the controls are logical, consistent, and well tested. Less so with PCVR only controllers. Though less of a problem with the knuckles, it's not never a problem. And also, again, I'm talking a little bit more about the knuckles briefly later. But it was this constant irritant with the swords and also, therefore, the wands too, of course. So that's really irritating. And there's been a lot of games where I've just had to put up with a suboptimal configuration that I really didn't want to use, but I just can't change. Very irritating. So I wish developers would put more fucking work into their games, is what I'm saying. Yeah. I often shout at developers. They fuck things up a lot, and they're small companies. I want to be patient with them, but guys, stop fucking up. Moving on a little bit. Pimax was definitely limited by the design constraints of the wands. They couldn't just do whatever they wanted because VR controllers don't work like that. There's exactly 3 kinds, and that's it. So, and if you're thinking, okay, there's the ET and etc., those are nowhere near mass market, and they are emulating something else. Okay? So this is where things become bitchy. Because to get compatibility, they had to pretty much perfectly emulate the wands. But the wands are actually a pretty primitive controller in a lot of ways. They don't have modern things that we like capacitive buttons, for example. We don't have capacitive buttons on the swords. The grip button doesn't actually have a pressure-sensitive button like, say, the Quest 2 controllers have. Or, of course, the grip sensor on the knuckles, even though it's not a button, it is pressure-sensitive. So the amount you're pressing the button or squeezing the controller is registered in game, and sometimes your character can react with that. Probably even not very often, but nonetheless, there would be a feature that you'd sort of expect from a modern controller, and it isn't there. Again, the grip is just on or off. Very simple. To be fair, not a lot that can go wrong, but it's a bit, it just feels primitive. And of course, you have to bring up the finger tracking and how Pimax still doesn't have an ETA on it. When I was in contact with them, they told me it's being worked on. They expect to get it working someday, but they're not saying when. And I gotta wonder if they really are. Especially since their new headsets are using what are essentially the same controllers on the Quest 2. A newer iteration of that technology, but it's going to be pretty much the same controller. They certainly look identical. So these are Qualcomm controllers, and that's what we'll be seeing going forward from Pimax. So you can use your existing base station tracked controllers with the compatibility faceplate. I certainly will be getting that, but I don't fully trust that Pimax is going to continue to work on those finger tracking sensors, especially since they've now got new controllers out, which as far as I know won't have finger tracking either. They'll be just like the Quest ones, which at least have capacitive buttons though, right? So that's something. Also, it's just worth mentioning that I feel like the lack of the grip button pressure sensor would be largely mitigated if they had that finger tracking, right? Because then you'd still be able to open and close the hand in a natural way, not just full close or full open. If you had those finger tracking sensors, you wouldn't really care about the lack of the pressure sensitivity on that button. So it's a shame they just did not get that working, and I'm not convinced they ever will. I'd love to be proven wrong. Pimax, feel free to prove me wrong. Okay? Go ahead, dudes. That'd be awesome. We'd all appreciate it. We really would, dudes. Come on. I know it's a hard problem. I get it's a complicated problem. Like, I understand there's a lot of problems, specifically from Valve's end and just limitations of Steam VR and just how VR controllers are in general, not an open field like regular PC gamepads are. They are not the same thing, not even close, guys. I understand that, but there's got to be some fucking way. Dudes, there's got to be some way. Find it out. Now the ugly. And I gotta tell you, I'm not gonna soften this. I know I have a reputation somewhat of being a bit of a Pimax fangirl, but I'm telling you, there's no bullshit on my channel, okay? This is the ugly, and it is ugly. The trigger sucks. And that really stinks, because the trigger's kind of the main event, right? That's when I'm about to shoot somebody. I can't have that fucking bad. That part needs to work. And the trigger does work a little bit overzealously is the problem. Let me show you. I've got some video clips here of the trigger on the Knuckles, trigger on the Quest 2, and the trigger on the Pimax swords, and you'll see the problem. Okay, so I'm touching the trigger, and I'm pulling it all the way up, and then you can see it clicks, blinks twice there for full activation. And here, I'm just holding it as steady as I can in the middle. Okay, much the same. It doesn't necessarily capacitor, but the lightest touch activates it, and I'm just holding it in the middle. Note that it does not have a full activation click, okay? So it's just the trigger's pulled or not. Oh, same test here. It does have a click on full activation close to the Knuckles. But here's where things become a little gnarly. You can see that there's so much jitter on that trigger, and that's where the problem shows up. Look how much that is. That is so much jitter. So pay attention here to the ammo counters and firing off some shots. 14, 12, 10, 8, 7, 6, right? It's double firing off shots. Well, look at this now. There we go. That's triggered halfway. You can reliably dump your mag unintentionally with this. Single shots require very deliberate trigger pull. So yeah. You can see there's so much problems there. Also, and it's not, you may not have noticed this, but there's so much slop on that trigger. You have to be halfway down on that trigger before it registers a view of having your finger on it at all. That's way too much. That is way too much slop. It should be picking up that I'm applying a slight amount of pressure right away. And I don't think that's a feature on the wands. I don't think the wands do that. I don't know for sure. I don't own wands. But I doubt the trigger on the wands was that shit. I refuse to believe it was that shit. The trigger on these is not good. Pimax, how did you fuck this up, guys? Guys, I'm serious. How did you fuck up the trigger? How did this get approved, guys? What the hell were you thinking? What the hell were you thinking, guys? I don't know what I'm stunned by how this got by. And it's not just my swords. I have a friend with swords, and she actually reported this to me first, because I didn't immediately notice. And you can also notice that's not just if you hold it in the sweet spot, okay? Because I do that in a couple of those clips there. But you also notice when I'm firing single shots, sometimes it'll double tap off around. I also noticed that in Into the Radius and a couple other games. How does that happen? To fire off these rounds, you have to very deliberately pull the trigger to get a single round off. That's also bad, right? That's bad for accuracy, guys. How did you fuck this up? I don't like to say bad things about what is my favorite VR company, but guys, I'm also not going to lie for you. This trigger sucks. You shouldn't have fucked up on this. Alright, so the conclusion. What do I actually think of the swords? Well, despite the presence of some flaws, and some things Pimax could have done something about, like the trigger, and then the game configuration stuff is really just developers and a huge part of the crap that is called the Unity game engine. So, yeah, so despite the flaws, the sword controllers are basic, rugged, straightforward controllers that for the most part do what's on the tin. They work well within their limitations of being a corrected Vive wand, right? Because these are Vive wands with a sense of ergonomics actually applied to them. And I think that Pimax has actually nailed the ergonomic parts of these controllers very well. I'm very pleased with that. It'd be nice and would be more immersive and make up for the simplicity of the grip button if that finger tracking was working. So Pimax, come on guys. I know it's hard, but do it. Right? Do it. The bad trigger is a problem that requires the user to pay attention to how they're handling their guns in games. You shouldn't have to, but you do. I don't call it a deal breaker though, and I know a lot of you will think that it is. But really, it's not, because I went for most of this time period where I was using it as my daily driver without actually noticing it. Once in a while, I thought maybe I might have fired off a second round, but I was never sure. It wasn't until I actually sat down and tested it that I really noticed the failings of that trigger. But once you know about it, you sort of focus on it a bit. And that stinks. But it's not like the trigger doesn't work, and it's not like you can't fire single rounds, and it's not like it's unpleasant to use in any other way. So okay, I don't consider that a deal breaker, but it is an unfortunate oversight and quality control issue that Pimax should not have let slip. That said, I still like these controllers. However, a lot of the marketed features really fail to deliver any actual benefit. I mean, obviously the hot swap battery really doesn't matter. I mean, you got 4 hours of battery life. After 4 hours, you're gonna go take a pee or something, aren't you? You know, at least at my age you do. And that's when you maybe swap your batteries. The battery life, by the way, does show up in something like FPS VR. So I do know what the battery life of my controllers is. Very useful. FPS VR is just great in general. So I don't. The hot swap doesn't really matter, does it? User replaceable is nice, but given that the Knuckles have something like 7-8 hours of battery life, I don't consider this all that much of an advantage over it. I mean, if you're playing for more than 7-8 hours, if that's something you do, then this replaceable battery is actually pretty great, because the batteries charge super fast. Like, your battery will be charged long before you wear out the next pair. You can actually use these controllers infinitely by just swapping out the batteries every 4 hours or so. So that's something, but I personally don't game for that long. So it kind of doesn't matter. The only time I ever swapped is when I deliberately ran my controllers dry. I think honestly the biggest draw of the swords is that they probably won't fall apart like the Knuckles have a tendency to. Yeah, there's no joystick to break. The trackpad seems really good, really solid. Very satisfying click to it. I really like it. So they should not have the longevity problems that the Knuckles have. And I think that's probably, unfortunately, the biggest draw out of the swords. And it's not nothing. Being able to use your controllers without worrying about them breaking from normal usage is actually a pretty big deal. Okay? I already made my Knuckles once. And that's because a piece of plastic broke on the thing that holds your hand into the controller, whatever you want to call that. The strap and the plastic broke on there. And I sometimes think maybe my joysticks are beginning to drift, but they haven't drifted to the point of it being a problem yet. Not yet, but I think it's close. Right? So it's nice to have an alternative to the Knuckles in terms of their just terrible problems is reliability. And these do fill that gap. However, I have to also say, I've owned these controllers for like a month and a half, so I can tell you that in the month and a half, I've had 0 hardware problems with them. However, I didn't have hardware problems with my Knuckles in the first month and a half. We don't actually know if these do have a potential underlying hardware problem. We don't know that yet. They haven't been out long enough. So hopefully not. So I can tell you that these feel solid, and there's nothing obvious that looks like it'll break. And in my testing time of about a month and a half, nothing is broken. But I can't tell you actually if a year later this will still be true. There's that. I still can't even necessarily promise you that these are more durable. So personally, I like the swords. I use them. I think they are comfortable to use, and the value of them not falling apart is pretty great. There's really no getting around the fact these aren't as good as they could have been, though. If you look at that bad trigger sensor, the simplicity of it, the fact that they had to base it so closely off the Vive wands really held back what could have been actually a pretty damn good controller. Without a whole lot more work, too. Like, it's so close to being a great controller, but only really I'd call it a okay controller. That does the job. It does the job, but that's kind of it. You won't hate them. You won't love your swords, really. You'll be like, these do what I need them to do, and in that sense, they're decent and functional. Even just getting goddamn finger tracking working would at least give you some kind of zazzle on these controllers. But there's just no zazzle on them at all. Not breaking is only so much zazzle. It's really not a lot, since you aren't asking for a lot there anyway, Valve. I'll say also that the simple grip button, while it sounds kind of like a negative, in a way it is also kind of a positive though. Because, you know, if you're playing a game where you reload a lot, say you play the shotgun in After the Fall, what do? You're just firing shells into that thing as fast as you can, right? You're just throwing shells into your shotgun constantly. And having the controller's grip setting be anything less than perfect really will interrupt your reload in a bad way. That used to happen to me all the time when I played with my knuckles. Never a problem with the swords. So simple and boring, and probably overly simple, that grip button is, it just does its one thing and it does it very well, and it just has never been a problem. And I do appreciate that. Sometimes simple is better, but I'm also going to say that the Quest 2 controllers have a same grip button, and I've never had issues with that either, and it still is more advanced than just on-off. I feel like there could have been a really cool controller here if there just wasn't so many limitations on what Pimax had to work with in terms of compatibility. And you can say, okay, that's not really Pimax's fault, but if you own swords, it's still your problem no matter whose fault it is. Rather, it's just that VR controllers are not as open as you would think, or just limitations of what Pimax could do. As much as I like these controllers, I don't love them. It's worth noting though, I mean, I own both knuckles and swords, right? I own them both. I paid full price for both. Actually, I got the swords a little bit cheap. There are definitely some games I absolutely prefer using the swords over the knuckles with. And there are some games I prefer the knuckles. But there are no games I hate with the swords, but there are games I hate with the knuckles. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Because you might be thinking to yourself, this review sounds pretty negative for the swords. And in a way you're right, but a review like this is meant to be negative and harsh, okay? Because I'm not really pointing out so much all the ways that they worked really well. I did a little bit at the beginning, but mostly it sounds like I have negative stuff to say. And that's true. But that kind of would have been true of anything. So I'm going to remind you of all the things that piss me off about the fucking knuckles. Yeah, because a lot of you probably forget that there's significant flaws with the knuckles, or you've just gotten so used to putting up with it, it's just a habit now. So, of course, first off, as everybody knows, those joysticks will eventually drift whether you push it on the click or not. It's gonna happen in a long enough timeline. Something better might come out before it happens to you, but I know people, and you can go and ask online, you'll see people who've had many RMAs of their knuckles. Like a crazy number, like 7 or more, okay? The knuckles are not rugged, well-made controllers. There are serious quality controls issues with them. And even the quality of the knuckles returned from RMA, I understand that these are repaired controllers, and if they're properly repaired, I don't care. That's fine, as long as they work. But some of them have come back pretty stanky looking, pretty disgusting. Users have posted photos of getting controllers back with mold on them. Fucking disgusting, Valve. So, yeah. That's just way too high a failure rate on these controllers for me to ever consider these a good controller. I mean, to be a requisite of being good, it must work, right? I don't think that's unreasonable. So, the joystick problem is a massive problem on your knuckles, because you know, almost certainly, at some point, you're going to have to RMA the fucking things, no matter how much you baby them. And I know there's a couple of users out there. I know you're out there and you're going to say something like, oh no, my knuckles have been perfect. Let me tell you something, fella. Everything is perfect before it breaks. Okay? Just because it's perfect yesterday doesn't mean it'll be perfect today. And just because it's perfect today doesn't mean it won't be broken tomorrow. That's the nature of the knuckles. Just fucking deal with it. These are not well-made controllers. They're very advanced, they're very cool, they're very modern. They have cool grip sensors and finger tracking, capacitive buttons, a touchpad for some reason, but they're built like shit. Second, the grip sensor is actually kind of shitty. I get that it's immersive and I like that aspect of it, but it's so goddamn fussy. And the fact that I needed to get boosters is an irritant. I don't need anything like that for any other controller. Why did I need to go buy boosters from Kiwi Design for an outrageously high price, by the way? That's stupid. They should have designed this controller to fit normal hands, for fuck's sakes. I have pretty big hands, but they're not freakishly big. Not freakishly. So what the hell, Valve? Who did they test this on? Yeah, so I don't understand that. And then even with the booster, the grip sensor is still extremely unreliable. The fact that I have to go into almost every game and tweak my thresholds, and that can take kind of a while too, and it's irritating. For almost every game is just bad design. Why is it so fussy? I have to say I don't particularly like it. And again, for a game like After the Fall, where I'm just slamming shotgun shells into my old shotgun, the grip sensor was just not accurate enough for that rapid of movement. And is the grip sensor just not being good enough? It's close, but as soon as I switch to a simple button or even the Quest 2 controllers, not a problem. It's that the sensors are not all they're made out to be. Don't be a fanboy. They're not perfect. I realize they work for certain people's hands better than others, though. But they don't work well for mine at all. So that stinks. Valve could have done a better job. Another thing, too, is that the actual plastic is pretty cheap. And a good way to test this, you can do this at home. Open up your Steam VR, go to the controller test, and squeeze until the grip pressure is at its maximum. You will hear the plastic creaking. I'm not the only person to observe this. Don't say it's just my knuckles. That plastic is pretty cheap. And I have seen people with the actual finger tracking sensor pad broken. Okay? Not a great quality decision there. I feel like in a lot of ways, as much as I really enjoy the immersive aspect of just grabbing something like I would similarly in real life, I just feel like in some ways they're just more trouble than they're worth. I'd prefer just a goddamn simple button that I always know will behave exactly how I expect. Like it does on the swords, like it does on the Quest 2 controllers. Actually, and again, about the sensors, there's at least 2 games I own. I never could get this grip sensor working reliably enough. That's Vengeful Rites and Beanstalker. I will not play those with my goddamn knuckles. It is borderline unplayable with them. I could just never get those work reliably enough. Especially in Beanstalker. My god, if you actually accidentally drop your climbing hook without noticing, you're in for a fall. Have fun. No, you will not, actually. Yeah, that trigger is notoriously fragile. Even a light impact on the sides of those triggers will break them. It is cheap plastic. They will break if you are not quite careful with it. Now, admittedly, I don't think it's super likely that you would hit the trigger and not your finger. But I've seen so many pictures of people with broken triggers on their knuckles. It's a thing that happens. And it's because the plastic they used was not that great. I've never seen that on a Quest 2 controller. I've seen broken tracking rings, but even then, considering how many of those things are out there, it's so rare to see anything go wrong with those controllers. So you gotta hand it to Meta that their controllers are pretty goddamn good. I almost kind of wish I could use them with my base stations. I'd use them, honestly, I would. Because you know what? They work. Okay, and lastly, actually it has a similar problem to the swords do. Bad defaults from developers. Again, developers. I swear to God, game developers just piss me off. I love them, but I also sometimes want to slap them. And in this case, it's that game developers so often assign a function that you use frequently to the joystick click. How could they be doing that still? Guys, what are you thinking when you do that? You know you're going to destroy your goddamn customers' fucking joysticks doing that. Alright, you cannot use that goddamn joystick click. It will very rapidly destroy the goddamn joystick on the knuckles. Why are you doing this? Developers, use your fucking brains once in a while, okay? Like, seriously, you've gone through all the effort of making the graphics, the design, the sound, and then to fuck up at the last 1% about controller configurations? It blows my mind, and you can tell it infuriates me. Because you've done all the work, then the last tiny little bit you fuck up. At least with the knuckles, you can almost always rebind it to something else. And almost every game doesn't use the trackpad, giving you a free magic extra button to use for whatever was on the joystick click, even though that's not always great from an ergonomic perspective. Nonetheless, it is an option that's there for you. So yeah, it's not like the knuckles are these amazing controllers either. There's a lot of shit for me to throw at them. And it's also worth pointing out that Valve has never done anything to fix them. Don't tell me hardware revisions aren't a thing. Guys, I have repaired laptops, computers, electronics most of my entire life. Hardware revisions are real and they're common, and Valve could do that too. They just don't. So I don't want to have the gushing about their customer service, dudes. They could fix these problems. When they get in, they could fix these to the RMA customers. They could fix it for new ones sold. They're just not doing it because they don't give a shit. That's the fact of it. Okay? You couldn't find a better joystick part somewhere? Bullshit. Couldn't toughen up that trigger a little bit with a tougher plastic? Bullshit. So, no, I don't want to hear about how great the knuckles are. Frankly, a huge reason why I was excited for the swords, and I'm a little bit disappointed with them, is because I wanted something more reliable than the goddamn knuckles. And while the swords are more reliable, their basicness and really lack of, I'm just going to say, zazzle, means I don't consider them in any way an ideal replacement for the knuckles. I like the swords. There are a number of games I definitely prefer using the swords over the knuckles, but there's a lot of games I prefer the knuckles. And certainly something like VR chat, it's the knuckles, no doubt about it. So that is my review of the Pimax swords. They're a mixed bag. They got a lot right. Especially ergonomically, they really got it right. But the details, they did not. And that's a shame. And I'll say it one last time, that trigger is unacceptable. I can't believe Pimax did that. Alright, lads, lovelies, everyone in between, thanks for tuning in, thanks for watching. I hope this gave you something to think about. I'm not saying don't get swords, I'm not saying I hate the swords. Because I also wouldn't say I love the knuckles either, would I? Right? None of these VR controllers are thrilling me. The swords don't either. That said, there's advantages to them over the knuckles. I just wish I feel like they should have been cheaper, considering how relatively basic they are. And I think if these had been like an extra $50 or even $100 less than the knuckles, these actually would have been quite appealing despite a couple of flaws. But seeing as they're only like $70 cheaper than the knuckles, I feel like a lot of users would just say, I'll just pay the extra $70 and put up with RMA my controllers once in a while. You get a better experience out of them, and I get that. So, yeah, thanks for tuning in. Thank you for your likes, your subscribes, your shares, your comments. And I love you, and I'll see you for my next video later. Bye-bye.